One side of me says, wow, what an attractive chick. I'd like to talk to her, date her. The other side of me says, I wonder how her head would look on a stick. As a rule, most serial killers cannot even tell why they did what they did. Why think about this stuff when you are too busy squirming your way out of getting a life sentence or the dreaded death penalty? In contrast, Big Ed begged to be executed by torture. Edmund Emil Kemper III is both one of the most brutal killers in American history and one of the most personable. Hearing him talk, one would never assume the man could have caused so much death and destruction. He fooled them all, including the first two victims of his murderous spree. Mary Ann Pash and Anita Lucchesa were catching a ride. Mary Ann had been to Europe and hitched all across the continent. Anita was a novice in comparison, but she was game all the way. It didn't scare her that a killer was on the loose. So when an innocuous, bespectacled man pulled up and offered them a ride, Anita beamed and jumped into the car. A more experienced and cautious Mary Ann hesitated a few seconds, appraising the two-door 1969 Ford Galaxy and its driver, and got in as well. Ed Kemper was a pro at giving rides to hitchers. By then, he turned it into a game that was about to get bloody. It was May 7, 1972. Santa Cruz, California was a haven for hippies. The feministic movement was booming too, with women gaining more and more freedom. These women were of a new breed. They were proud and self-assured. Few hesitated to fight for their rights. These women both attracted and scared Big Ed. The truth was he didn't know how to build a romantic relationship. He felt powerless, sterile, almost impotent, but he still had the upper hand. He was exceedingly clever. He'd have them all the same. Whenever he pulled up next to a hitcher, he'd perform a little act.
Just a glance at my watch and look slightly irritated and, oh, well, I guess I can stop and give this person a ride. It seemed to have a very positive effect, even with the most sophisticated hitchers, which included the Pash and Lucchesa girls, the first two victims.
When Mary Ann and Anita noticed that the driver was taking them off route, he pulled a gun on them. Assuming the role of a victim and pretending to be suicidal, Kemper drove them to a secluded area and killed them both. He proceeded in a similar fashion, killing 4 more girls before finally deciding he needed to eliminate the source of his rage. As with most serial killers, he had a rough upbringing. His father, Edmund Emil Kemper Jr., a World War II vet, had horrible fights with his mother, Clarnell Kemper. Clarnell was a domineering woman and derived sick pleasure out of psychological torture. Suicide missions in wartime and the atomic bomb testings were nothing compared to living with Clarnell, Edmund Kemper Jr. would say. When his parents divorced, Ed Kemper was just 9 years old. With his dad gone, Clarnell used her son as a scapegoat and subjected him to relentless psychological torture. A teenager 6 feet 4 inches high, he was a veritable giant, but to Clarnell, he still wasn't man enough. She refused to show him any affection because she thought it might turn him gay.
She'd make you feel guilty and really crazy. She'd always say, you don't love me, and this kind of thing. She could be really harsh. When she'd get uptight or mad, she could really cut to the bone, and she did that a lot to my brother. She'd just strip him down and say, you're just like your father.
But it wasn't just about verbal attacks. Bent on making Ed's life as miserable as possible, Clarnell had him living in a cold, windowless, rat-infested basement. It was there, as early as 8 years old, that the kid started having vivid, morbid fantasies about beheading his mother. Soon, he was killing and mutilating small animals, including their 2 pet cats.
One time we were kids, and he was cleaning my dad's .22 rifle. I guess you could call it my brother's, since my dad was in Memphis. We were down in the living room, we were by ourselves, and it went off. And it was aimed towards me, but I moved about an inch out of the way and it went into the bookcase. And I've never questioned anything if it was intentional or anything. Because he just said, wow, you know, oops.
Living with Clarnell was getting unbearable. In 1963, at the age of 14, Ed ran off to his father, who lived in Van Nuys, California, with his new wife, Alfreda, and her son. Alfreda was very beautiful, and Ed had trouble being around her. He'd get uptight and just stare at her, fascinated by her looks. It alarmed the woman enough to complain to her husband. His weirdo son had been living with him only a month, but it was time he was out of the picture. That Christmas, Edmund Emil Jr. took Ed to visit his parents, who lived about 2 miles west of North Fork. Afterward, he left his son behind, abandoning him for the second time. Right off the bat, his grandma promised Ed that their relationship would be the opposite of what he had with his mother. But very soon, she was treating him in the same domineering manner. One day, Ed and his grandma had a big fight. He stormed out of the room and returned, clenching his rifle. "Oh, you'd better not be shooting the birds again." Those were her last words before her grandson shot her dead. Later, Kemper would say that he killed his grandfather too, just so that he wouldn't get upset. Having shot both of them, he had a nervous breakdown.
It made it worse to be on top of a mountain. I was literally on top of a mountain when it happened. And I sensed everybody in the world just stopping what they were doing, turning around, saw what I did, and are coming to get me.
At a loss as to what to do, Ed called his mother, who shouted at him and told him to turn himself in. So he did just that. Kemper's case was so brutal and incomprehensible to the court psychologists that they diagnosed him as a paranoid schizophrenic and put him into a Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security facility for mentally ill convicts.
So here's a 15-year-old boy, massive, but he's still 15 years old, in this facility with other adults. There were 1,600 inmates. 24 of them were murderers, and 800 of them were sex offenders.
It's believed that it was the Atascadero inmates who taught Ed, if you're gonna rape someone, you better kill them, so there are no witnesses. Ed was a smart kid. His IQ was tested to be 145, an IQ approximating that of a genius. So it's no wonder that he quickly learned his way around. Soon, he was helping the doctors with psychological tests. Nobody noticed that he was also studying them meticulously. In 6 years, exactly on his 21st birthday, Ed was released on parole. Tragically, the authorities disregarded the advice of the Atascadero psychologists and housed Ed with his mother. By that time, Clarnell had had 2 more unsuccessful marriages and was very angry with men in general. She worked as administrative assistant at the University of California, Santa Cruz. The work was hard and getting harder, so Clarnell started drinking heavily, and Ed was right there, the perfect beating bag, whom she'd accuse of her not having had sex for the past 7 years.
My mother was a sick, angry, hungry, and very sad woman. I hated her, but I wanted to love my mother.
Having attended a community college, he hoped to become a police officer, but was rejected for his height of 6 feet 9 inches. Big Ed went through a couple of menial jobs before getting hired by the State of California Division of Highways. It was there that Ed learned his way around the city. Soon, he found out that one could get from downtown to the middle of nowhere in mere minutes. Considering what he had in mind, it was a very convenient place to live. In his free time, Big Ed used to give people rides, almost as a hobby. Soon he noticed how easy it was to pick someone and how trusting the people were. His dark fantasies kicked in. His mom would tell him, "Those women are too good for you. Stop trying. You could never have a woman like that." He told me that he thought, "Yes, Mom, I can have them, by killing them." Every time Ed got into an argument with his mother, the fantasies would get darker. The rage welling up in him would threaten to overflow.
You were involved in the campus because your mother worked there.
Yes. I was also involved in killing co-eds because my mother was associated with college work, college co-eds, women, and had had a very strong and violently outspoken position on men.
Mary Ann Pesch and Anita Lucchesa were college students. So were his 3 other victims. Kemper would suffocate, strangle, or shoot the girls. Then he'd take the bodies to his apartment, where he'd behead them and perform acts of necrophilia and cannibalism. He'd keep the severed head like a trophy. It wasn't the act of murder that gave him pleasure. It was the act of possession, of domination. For once, Ed was with women and in control. That was the thing that gave him the biggest gratification. The actual act of murder repulsed him. Later, Kemper would suppose the beheading fetish had to do with an incident in his childhood when his father chopped off the head of their pet chicken. His mother, Clarnell, cooked the chicken and insisted that her son eat it. The community of Santa Cruz was awash with fear. People were found murdered. Body parts were washed up on a local beach. A serial killer, Herbert Mullen, was caught. He alone had murdered 13 people, and the murders continued. Students got mindful of who was willing to give them a ride. Some abandoned hitchhiking altogether. The police were at a loss of who was killing all the co-eds. Nobody could suspect the gentle giant Ed Kemper. After all, the guy used to hang out with police officers in the jury room, a bar favored by the local law enforcement workers. Policemen saw him as a friendly nuisance with drinking problems. One day, Kemper resisted his murderous urge while giving a ride to a pair of students. The guilt of the previous murders was eating him, he would confess later. Suddenly it dawned on him that all he was doing was killing the image of his mother over and over again. But it didn't help. The real problem was still in place. Clarnell was alive.
I said, she's got to die, and I've got to die, or girls like that are going to die. And that's when I decided I'm going to murder my mother. I knew a week before she died, I was going to kill her.
On April 20, 1973, 52-year-old Clarnell came back home drunk. It was late, and her return woke Kemper up. He opened the door to his mother's bedroom. She was reading a paperback. "I suppose you're going to want to sit up all night and talk now," she said. "No, good night," her son replied, and went back to his room. Kemper chain-smoked for an hour, struggling with himself. Then, when he was sure his mother was asleep, he took a hammer in one hand, a knife in the other, and walked back to Clarnell's bedroom. He proceeded to desecrate her body in the usual fashion. His last victim was his mother's friend, Sally Hallett. Kemper invited her over and killed her so that the two women would go missing together. It had looked like they went off on a holiday trip, Kemper thought. The next morning, he packed his car with guns and ammunition, getting ready for a potential standoff with the police. Just like in John Wayne movies he liked so much. He got into the car and drove east, gulping no-dose caffeine tablets. Finally, when Kemper reached Pueblo, Colorado, he got into the public phone booth and called the Santa Cruz police. He had to call twice because the officer wouldn't believe him. He was still on the phone when the local police arrived. While in custody, Kemper tried to commit suicide twice. He was asked for the death penalty for himself, and death by torture at that, all the while very obviously basking in the attention he was getting. On November 8, 1973, Kemper received 8 life sentences to be served concurrently. He was just 24 years old. A man so young, Kemper was responsible for 10 deaths, including his grandparents. During his time, Kemper's been a model prisoner. Just like at the Atascadero State Hospital, he became an active member of the closed society. He spent over 5,000 hours narrating hundreds of audiobooks. He was in charge of multiple prison activities, like scheduling other inmates' appointments with psychiatrists.
Out in the foyer, there's a trophy case. Take a look at it. There's several trophies in there, and a couple of them have my name on them.
Kemper also willingly gave a lot of interviews, delving into the nature of his crimes and his motives. All around an exemplary prisoner, Ed Kemper is. FBI profiler John Douglas said Kemper was capable of rare insight for a violent criminal and helped him in his study on serial killers, drawing attention to things like animal abuse and other contributing factors of one's upbringing, things that could serve as red flags for psychologists. There's somebody out there that is watching this and hasn't done that, hasn't killed people and wants to, and rages inside and struggles with that feeling, or is so sure they have it under control. They need to talk to somebody about it. Trust somebody enough to sit down and talk about something that isn't a crime. Thinking that way isn't a crime. Doing it isn't just a crime, it's a horrible thing. Ed Kemper, a brutal serial killer with a conscience, knew he was a monster. He was the first to tell people that. After all, he was the one who ended his killing spree, turning himself in. And he seems honest in his self-deprecation and guilt. Or is he just trying to trick the whole world, like he tricked the hitches he picked up? Like he fooled the doctors of the Atascadero Mental Hospital? It's a secret Ed Kemper will take to his grave.